Typhoid Mary. She cooked for the wealthy, and she knew exactly what she was doing to them. Mary Mallon was one of the best cooks in New York City at the turn of the 20th century. Wealthy families hired her without hesitation. She was reliable, skilled, and always in demand. But wherever she went, people ended up in hospital beds, fever, vomiting, death. Between 1900 and 1907, she moved through 8 households. 7 of them suffered typhoid outbreaks. By the time anyone noticed the pattern, she was already gone. No name left behind, no forwarding address, nothing. In 1906, a sanitary engineer named George Soper was hired to track down the source of an outbreak in Oyster Bay. 6 out of 11 people in one wealthy household had fallen desperately ill. Soper eliminated every possibility. The water was clean. The food supply was fine. The shellfish checked out. Then he pulled the employment records, and a name kept surfacing. A tall Irish cook who always seemed to leave just as people started dying. He tracked her to an apartment in Manhattan. He explained his findings calmly, and he asked for blood samples. She grabbed a carving fork, and she chased him out of the building. When authorities finally showed up in 1907 to take her in, it required 5 police officers and a female physician who had to physically restrain her in the ambulance. Testing confirmed what Soper had suspected. Mary's gallbladder was producing Salmonella typhi bacteria by the millions. She felt completely fine. She showed 0 symptoms, but every dish she prepared without washing her hands became a delivery mechanism for a deadly pathogen. She was quarantined on North Brother Island, and 3 years later, health officials made a decision they would deeply regret. They released her with one strict condition: never work as a cook again. She agreed. She lied. 5 years later, an outbreak tore through Sloan Maternity Hospital in Manhattan. 25 infected, 2 dead. Doctors, nurses, new mothers. The cook's name on the employment record was Mary Brown. It was her. Back she went to North Brother Island, and this time the door didn't open again. She spent her final 23 years there in permanent isolation, a total of 26 years imprisoned without ever standing trial. She died in 1938. An autopsy found live typhoid bacteria still multiplying in her gallbladder. The official count stopped at 51 infections and 3 deaths, but historians suspect the real numbers were far higher. She had worked under so many false names that tracing every outbreak was impossible. The woman knew what she was. She chose to keep cooking anyway. The infected blood scandal. They had a version that wouldn't kill anyone. They buried it, and they shipped the old one overseas. In the early 1980s, hemophiliacs had one lifeline: a clotting medication called Factor VIII. Without it, a small cut or a bruised joint could spiral into uncontrolled internal bleeding. The drug was genuinely revolutionary, but producing it required pooling plasma donations from up to 60,000 different donors per batch. That scale was the flaw that became a catastrophe. Pharmaceutical companies paid cash for plasma donations. Cash payments attracted the riskiest donors: prison inmates, intravenous drug users, high-risk populations who needed money fast and who weren't always screened carefully. Nobody fully understood transmission yet, but one infected donor could corrupt an entire batch, and thousands of batches were already shipping worldwide. By 1982, the CDC had begun reporting hemophiliacs contracting a mysterious new illness. By early 1983, internal documents inside Bayer's Cutter Biological Division acknowledged what was happening. The science was pointing directly at plasma products. A competitor moved first. By May 1983, a heat-treated version of Factor VIII existed, one that destroyed the virus before it ever reached a patient. Bayer followed in February 1984, releasing the safer formula across the United States and Europe. They did not destroy the old inventory. Cutter's internal records show they kept manufacturing the untreated product for months after the safer version was available. When distributors abroad asked about switching, they were told to exhaust the old stock first. Over 100,000 vials of potentially contaminated Factor VIII were shipped to Asia and Latin America. When doctors in Hong Kong asked directly whether what they were receiving carried AIDS risk, Bayer assured them it was the same quality product they had always received. It was. That was the entire problem. Thousands of hemophiliacs tested positive for HIV. In Japan, nearly the entire hemophiliac AIDS population had been infected through Factor VIII. In the United Kingdom, more than 1,200 people contracted HIV, and close to 3,000 have since died. The UK's Infected Blood Inquiry recently described the scandal as a calamity born from systemic failure at every level of government and medicine. In the United States, an estimated 10,000 hemophiliacs were infected, including Ryan White, a 13-year-old who became the public face of the epidemic before dying at 18. Companies paid hundreds of millions in settlements. Not a single executive faced prison. They had the cure ready. They had the evidence in front of them, and they made a choice to protect their inventory costs over human lives. Every vial they shipped after that decision was a verdict they wrote themselves. The Siege of Kafa. They had no idea they were already dead men walking, and when they ran, they took the plague with them. In 1346, the Mongol Golden Horde had been laying siege to Kafa for nearly 3 years. Kafa was a wealthy Genoese trading colony on the Crimean coast, and it had held firm. Strong walls, supply lines running in from the sea. The Mongols couldn't crack it by force, and frustration was building. Then something arrived in their camp that no army could fight. Plague. Soldiers began collapsing by the thousands. Swollen lymph nodes, burning fevers. Death sometimes coming within hours of the first symptoms. The force that had terrorized half the known world was being dismantled by something it couldn't see. According to the Italian chronicler Gabriele de Mussi, the Mongol commanders responded with a decision that would alter the course of human history. They loaded their dead onto siege catapults, and they launched the corpses over the walls of Kafa. The defenders dragged the bodies toward the sea as fast as they could. It wasn't fast enough. Some modern scholars debate whether the catapulted dead alone caused transmission, arguing that rats and fleas inside the city were already spreading infection independently. Either way, the result was the same. People inside the walls began dying. By 1347, the Mongols, devastated by disease, abandoned the siege entirely. The Genoese had survived, and then they made the mistake that doomed a continent. They boarded ships and sailed home. Hundreds of merchants, sailors, and their families set course for Constantinople, Venice, Genoa, and every major port across the Mediterranean. They believed they were escaping. They had no language for what they were carrying, no concept of contagion, no practice of quarantine. That idea didn't exist yet. So infected ships docked in the busiest harbors in Europe, and sick sailors walked ashore into cities that had no defenses whatsoever. Within months, the Black Death had reached Italy. Within a few years, it had swept across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Entire villages ceased to exist. Cities lost half their populations in a matter of months. Bodies accumulated in the streets faster than the living could dig graves. The global death toll reached somewhere between 75 and 200 million people. Europe alone lost an estimated 25 to 50 million, somewhere between 30 and 60% of its entire population. The Mongols threw the first corpses, but it was the survivors of Kafa, terrified and fleeing for their lives, who carried the plague into the heart of civilization. They weren't trying to cause destruction. They were just trying to go home, and that's what made them so catastrophically dangerous. The Spanish flu. The deadliest pandemic in recorded history didn't come from Spain. It started on a military base in Kansas, and the government that knew about it sent infected soldiers to Europe anyway. In January 1918, a country doctor named Loring Minor noticed something alarming spreading through Haskell County, Kansas. A respiratory illness unlike anything he had seen before. Aggressive, fast-moving. He filed a warning with the United States Public Health Service. Nobody responded. 2 months later, on the morning of March 4th, 1918, an army cook named Albert Gitchell walked into the infirmary at Camp Funston and reported a fever, a sore throat, and severe muscle pain. Within a week, 522 soldiers at the same base were sick. The United States had just entered the First World War. Hundreds of thousands of troops were being shipped to Europe, and the virus traveled with every single convoy. By April, it had reached France. By May, it was across Europe. By summer, it had spread to every corner of the globe. But the world didn't know how bad it was. The United States, Britain, France, and Germany were all suppressing press coverage to protect wartime morale. Any report linking mass illness to military forces was buried. Spain was neutral. Spanish newspapers reported freely on the outbreak, and the world assumed that's where it had originated. The name stuck. It was a lie built on censorship, and it held for decades. The first wave was manageable. The second wave was unlike anything medicine had ever encountered. By autumn of 1918, the virus had mutated into something far more lethal. Patients developed fevers and lost the ability to breathe. Oxygen failed to reach their blood. Skin turned blue, then purple, then black. Physicians started calling it the Purple Death. Some patients collapsed and died within hours of their first symptom. The cruelest detail was who it targeted. Standard influenza killed the elderly and the frail. This strain was most lethal in people aged 20 to 40. Their own immune systems overreacted so violently that the response itself became fatal. A mechanism scientists now call a cytokine storm. In Philadelphia, city officials were warned explicitly not to hold a scheduled Liberty Loan Parade on September 28th. They held it anyway. 200,000 people packed the streets. Within 72 hours, every hospital bed in the city was full. Within weeks, 12,000 people were dead. By the time the pandemic finally burned out, it had infected an estimated 500 million people, roughly one-third of the entire world population. The death toll sits somewhere between 25 and 100 million, more than every combat death from the First World War, the Second World War, Korea, and Vietnam combined. The war itself killed 17 million. The disease it helped carry killed at least 3 times that number. It all traced back to a sick cook in Kansas and a chain of decisions made by men who decided troop movements mattered more than a rural doctor's warning. COVID-19. 6 years on, we still cannot say with certainty how it began. And for a virus that killed millions, that absence of an answer is one of the most disturbing facts of all. In the final days of December 2019, a 34-year-old ophthalmologist named Li Wenliang was seeing something troubling at Wuhan Central Hospital. Patients were arriving with a severe pneumonia that wasn't responding to standard treatment. Lab results flagged a coronavirus with alarming similarities to SARS, the pathogen that had nearly triggered a global pandemic back in 2003. On December 30th, Li sent a private warning to a group of fellow physicians. He urged caution. He shared what he was seeing. Within days, police summoned him and forced him to sign a statement confessing to spreading false information and seriously disrupting public order. On January 10th, he developed a cough after treating an infected patient. On February 7th, 2020, Li Wenliang was dead. The virus he had tried to warn the world about had already crossed every border anyone might have drawn around it. On March 11th, the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a global pandemic. Official figures recorded over 7 million deaths. Excess mortality studies suggest the true number is several times that figure, with some estimates placing the real global toll closer to 20 million or beyond. What we still cannot definitively answer is where it came from. The most widely supported theory points to natural spillover. A coronavirus circulating in bat populations infected an intermediate animal, possibly a pangolin, and then crossed into humans at the Huanan seafood market in Wuhan, where live wild animals were sold alongside standard groceries. Scientists had been publishing warnings since 2007 that bat coronaviruses represented a pandemic threat waiting to detonate. Nobody acted on those warnings with the urgency they demanded. The second theory points to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, located just miles from the market. Researchers there were actively studying bat coronaviruses. Some investigators believe a laboratory accident may have allowed the virus to escape before anyone realized what was happening. The United States intelligence community remains divided. No definitive evidence has settled the question either way. What is not disputed is what happened in those first critical weeks. Information was suppressed. The doctor who raised the alarm was silenced by police. The wet market was sanitized before independent scientists could collect samples. And by the time any government was willing to say clearly what was unfolding, the virus was already on every continent. COVID-19 dismantled economies, collapsed healthcare systems, and permanently changed the way the world understands infectious disease. And unlike every other catastrophe in this video, there is no clean verdict. No single clear mistake to point at. Maybe it was the wet markets. Maybe it was a lab. Maybe it was a decade of pandemic warnings that every government on Earth read, filed away, and quietly ignored.